Hello, Ocelots. Just kidding. Hello, Bobcats. Mr. Buckman here again. We're moving on to the Civil Rights era, and we're going to talk about government intervention in markets during this era. Now, I'm pretty sure you guys have heard a little bit about the Civil Rights era. We just had Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday. We've got Black History Month right now as well. Okay, we hear a lot about the Civil Rights era and protests, all right, and laws changing and desegregation specifically, right? But there's also some stuff that is going to be occurring with our economy as well, too, which is very important that we understand this as well. And we also need to understand that there are many different movements during the Civil Rights era. There is a movement for African American rights. There's a Chicano movement, which is celebrating the heritage of Hispanic Americans. Okay, there's also feminists, and there's the women's rights movement as well too. We got to make sure that we understand there's all these different moving parts during this time. And when we talk about these different groups and their roles in a workplace, we're going to need to make sure that we protect certain jobs from some of the discrimination that we saw during segregation. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about, and there's a lot of laws that are passed, and there's a lot of Supreme Court decisions that are issued during the Civil Rights era. But one of the most important laws that is written during the Civil Rights era is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay, and the next time one of you have to make a phone call to your parent, and you have to go into the kitchen area of Benchmark, I want you to look over at the far wall, and you're going to see a lot of posters. Some of those posters might talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Workplaces, like a school, have to post these laws and let workers know that they follow these laws. What did the Civil Rights Act of 1964 do? This asked businesses to fight discrimination. Well, what's a good way to fight discrimination? You just have to not consider race, religion, or sex when we are hiring, promoting, or firing. Okay? So just one more thing. So much the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does, but when we talk about households and businesses, it's important that we know the main idea with the economy here is that race, religion, and sex can no longer be considered in hiring, promoting, or firing. Why is a law like this needed? Well, if you think about it, if you think about like Birmingham, Alabama, and some of these places that were fighting in the middle of the civil rights movement, they were fighting against the effort to desegregate, okay? When you had states in the South that were trying to limit non-whites from voting and things like that, do you think those places are going to hire certain races to be management, for instance, at their business? They probably won't, because they have certain ideas about that, okay? And this kind of forces businesses, perhaps in a southern state, or perhaps in a place that if the government wasn't intervening, they probably would only hire whites for management. So the government needs to step in here, and they need to make an announcement and make sure that all workplaces, all 50 states, are guaranteeing fair opportunities to all races, also religion and men or women, okay? Civil Rights Act of 1964. Make sure you understand, I had the year 1964 missing for your lecture notes. It's up there now, okay? Another major thing I'd like to talk about with the Civil Rights era is what's known as the Equal Rights Amendment, okay? The Equal Rights Amendment. And in the 1960s and 1970s, the women's rights movement became a really big force in American politics. We have more women elected to office in this time. We have more women that are taking management positions in this time as well. But what happens with the Equal Rights Amendment, it's proposed, but it actually is never passed. Think about like the amendments to the Constitution, like the Bill of Rights, okay? This was a proposed amendment in the late 70s and early 1980s, because as more women entered the workplace, there are efforts, just like there's efforts to fight discrimination with the Civil Rights Act, there is efforts to make sure that we're fighting wage discrimination. What do I mean here? Well, it happened to be that as more women enter the workplace, they would find out what their male counterparts were being paid, and they would find out that their male counterparts were, in most cases, paid more than them for equal work, which is kind of unfair. Okay? So the Equal Rights Amendment is proposed to fight wage discrimination. All they're saying is if Sally, a woman, and then Joe, a man, work the same exact job, they should probably make the same salary. Okay? This amendment, the amendment to our Constitution, it would have required equal pay across the board for equal work. Now, as I mentioned, this amendment never passed, and women to this day still make less for equal work. Okay? It's true that there are more management, CEO, finance positions for women these days, and in fact, there's a lot of industries where women dominate and they do really well, okay? But it's important to know that we still deal with this issue here. This would have been, if it would have been an amendment, this would have been an example of the government intervening in negotiated wages, the market for resources. Remember our resources: labor, land, capital, entrepreneurial ability here. What they're saying, what this would have been intervention to make sure that women were being paid equally for equal work. Okay? So that's the Equal Rights Amendment. Civil Rights Act of 1964. This just says you cannot deny somebody management or a good paying job based on race, sex, or religion. Equal Rights Amendment is an effort to try to avoid the lower wages that women noticed they were making compared to men. Unfortunately, it was not passed. This could still be something in the future that we see politically, as more and more women maybe talk about this and protest this, okay? And there are a lot of men that are on board with this as well, too, okay? I've got one more video for you after this, and we're going to talk about the 21st century, some things that you might have actually experienced.